Alright, we should be live. We're back. So, new commander deck. We just finished selecting all the cards for it yesterday. Still need to wait until tomorrow for the full avatar spoiler. So far, none of the preview cards for today have been anything for Electro, but if there are any other mono red firebender cards, might want to consider them. But anyway, so in case you haven't seen him, Electro is 1 red red for a human villain 2/3. He has flying. You don't lose unspent red mana as steps and phases end. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery, you add a red mana. And when he leaves the battlefield, you may pay X. If you do, he deals X damage to target player. So, most notably about Electro is he is a leaves the battlefield trigger, so opponents cannot get around this by exiling him, by bouncing him back to your hand. They can make him lose all abilities, something along the lines of unable to scream, Darksteel mutation, things like that will rob him of all of his abilities will work on him. Because then once a stepper phase happens, you'll lose all that extra red mana. We have a couple of other cards that will on the list that will let us keep all of our red mana, but we'll get to those. So right now he is at 189 cards. So we're going to go over all of the cards that I picked for him during the card selection process. And then next time we'll start whittling this down. We want to get him down to about 60 spells, 40 lands. While he might be able to get away with fewer lands than a normal commander deck, he does benefit a lot from having extra lands to work with. Because you want to float all of his mana every single turn that you can. So, a lot of the cards in here are meant for that, so. Alright, so first up is Gauntlet of Might. I know it's an insanely expensive card. I don't know if we're going to run all 3 variants on Gauntlet of Might, because we do have quite a few cards that are similar to it on the list. There's 3 that are just straight up variants on it, and then there are a couple of other cards that have the same function for most of what the deck cares about. So if you don't actually have access to Gauntlet of Might and your playgroup doesn't allow proxies, don't worry about it. It's not a huge deal, but it is a mana flare only for mountains, so it is worth considering. Lightning Bolt, Red's universal, most efficient removal / burn spell ever printed. Soul Ring, another default. Wheel of Fortune, similar to Gauntlet of Might. I don't even know that we're running Wheel of Fortune, but it is possible for this deck to burn through its hand relatively quickly, and to also build up huge amounts of mana, so getting a fresh hand is probably worth considering. So, I don't have, Wheel of Misfortune, I think it is, the one where players have to bid life, and the lowest bidder doesn't get the effect. And I don't have Reforge the Soul, I don't think, on the list. I might. It's been a while. Avacyn was one of the first sets we looked at, so Reforge might actually be on the list. But you can substitute one of the ones that I'm not running for Wheel of Fortune for the same reason as Gauntlet of Might. It's not 100% necessary for the deck. And there are alternatives to running the insanely expensive cards. Legends gives us Chain Lightning, which is worse Lightning Bolt, but a lot of things are worse Lightning Bolt and still really good, because Lightning Bolt's one of the best cards ever. Blood Moon, there's a lot of non-basic land hate on the list. I don't know how much of it we're going to bother running. Denying the opponents their resources just gives him more time to get going and to build up a critical mass before they can do anything to him, or before they can start disrupting our mana production. So there are a bunch of non-basic land hate cards. Also, he's going to be a mono red deck. He's going to be almost entirely mountains, and cards like Blood Moon don't negatively impact him at all, because it just turns the land into a mountain. So now it's tapping for red, and it's getting the bonuses from cards like Gauntlet of Might. So Fisher is on the list. because it is one of Red's very few instant speed removal spells that straight up kills a creature. It does not care about toughness, so it does not have to deal lethal damage. So if you need to kill, like a giant green creature, you don't need to 2-for-1 yourself or dump 10 mana into a burn spell in order to get it off of the table. You can just kill it. There is one other card on the list, and we'll get to it, that can also do that. It's coming up very soon. In fact, nope, it's not the next one. Gorilla Shaman we have on the list because Mox Monkey kills artifacts very effectively. He kills treasures for 1 mana per treasure because he's based on casting cost. And the fact that we can float tons of mana means that if a truly problematic artifact shows up, we can kill that artifact most likely with our commander and Gorilla Shaman regardless of the casting cost. Only indestructible artifacts will be safe. So it ties into the potential for mana denial also if we go with the non-basic land destruction route. Pyrokinesis is a free spell that can kill a bunch of things, and free spells also mean extra red mana for Electro, because casting the spell gives us mana, so if we didn't spend anything on it, we actually go up mana. Cindercloud is the other variant on Fissure. While Fissure can destroy a land, it also doesn't allow regeneration. It uses the old terminology of bury. So while I do just have it written as destroy, it is destroy can't be regenerated. So while Cindercloud can't destroy a land, if it kills a white creature, it also deals damage to the controller equal to the white creature's power. So it does potentially deal some extra damage, especially if we kill a large angel, for example. Something other than Avacyn being all indestructible and everything. I think it actually has to destroy the creature to deal the damage. I have to double check that. Maybe it works on Avacyn just to dome them for 8. Sip of soda there. Fire Diamond, just another way to ramp and add red mana every turn cycle. Fire Blast, similar to Pyrokinesis, except it can go face, so it's a little bit better. It does kill 2 mountains instead of costing a red card, so long term the extra red mana from casting a spell will get undone by the 2 mountains we don't have every turn cycle. But on the other hand, it can be cast for free while we're tapped out, barring opponents having cost increasers. So it is a way to interact with a, kill the combo creature if it's small enough before their combo goes off or something similar. Or just to put an extra 4 damage on somebody's face before Electro dies and finishes somebody off. Orcish Settlers, if we continue down the mana denial route, XX red tap and sacrifice it to destroy X target lands. This deck can very easily just lopsided Armageddon the table. If it's been allowed to build up enough mana, it's just looking for an outlet for it. So Orcish Settlers is definitely a must-kill card for opponents at that point. Goblin Bombardment. So there are a lot of Goblin Makers on the list because of cards that add mana to our mana pool based on either creatures we control or creatures of specific types, including one card that specifies goblins and a couple other cards that care about goblins. So Bombardment is in here because we might have a large number of little creatures, and that lets us deal extra damage to help finish off our opponents. Ruby Medallion, so I have this thing whenever I build decks where when I get to a cost reducer that affects a large number of cards in the deck, is there's a specific mentality I have with cost reduction effects, and normally that mentality is how many spells per turn cycle am I going to cast that this thing reduces the casting cost of, because if it's only 1 pretty consistently, then it's worse than something like Mind Stone, because it effectively only saved me 1 mana, and 1 generic mana at that. So having something that tapped for a generic mana and could do other stuff would have been much better for the 2 mana slot. But Electro is slightly different because Electro gives me a mana every time I cast a spell. Well, cast... Is it instant or sorcery or is it non-creature? I'm blanking now. Instant or sorcery specifically. Okay. There are a few cards in his list that care about non-creatures, so I had a moment where I was just like, wait, what is his exact wording again? But so every time I cast an instant or sorcery, I get a mana back. But also, every red mana that I don't use to cast an instant or sorcery or anything else on my turn is another red mana I can float for Electro. So reducing the cost actually allows him to store unspent red mana more efficiently. So it's actually to his benefit to reduce the casting cost on as many spells as possible, as long as the effect that reduces the cost is a reasonable casting cost to begin with. So the 2 mana that I invest into Ruby Medallion can very easily be made up over a single turn cycle, even, depending on what I have to cast. Mog Infestation is both a red wrath that leaves behind a bunch of 1/1s. It only kills one player's creatures, so it's more of a bad, overwhelming, overwhelming onslaught, overwhelming assault. The one from Portal 3 Kingdoms that got reprinted in Outlaws of Thunder Junction. Overwhelming Forces. Overwhelming Forces is the name. Because it only kills one player's creatures. If it's me, though, it kills all of my stuff and gives me twice as many. So, regardless of whose things it kills, it gives that player 2 1/1 goblins for every creature that they lost. So if I kill all of my creatures, I get twice as many goblins. Electro's thing will be on the stack because he died, but so will all of the enters triggers for the goblins, and if I have any way to sacrifice them for more mana, because I will have Phyrexian Altar on the list also, then that's even more mana we can pump into Electro if need be. So it is a way to kill a bunch of creatures and make a ton of goblins. I don't know if it'll make the final list because some of the cards that I would be interacting with Mog Infestation don't work as well if all of my creatures have died already, so. But it does let me kill all my creatures, get twice that many 1/1s, and still have a chance to respawn while Electro's trigger is on the stack to add more mana. So it's up for consideration. And again, it can kill all creatures controlled by one of our opponents instead. Ruination destroys all non-basic lands just straight up. So against some players, it's going to be an Armageddon. And a lot of the time it will be a very lopsided Armageddon at that, because we don't have very many non-basics on our list. Speaking of which, Price of Progress is 2 mana to deal 2 damage to each player per non-basic land that player has. I'm a lot more inclined to run something like Price of Progress, I think, in the long run than Ruination, because I want to deal all of the extra damage to players. And also, Price of Progress works underneath the effects of Blood Moon. They're just non-basic mountains at that point, instead of, being turned into actual basic mountains for the purposes of card effects. So Price of Progress will still damage them, even though their mana base doesn't work properly anymore. Spell Shock just straight up deals 2 damage to a player whenever they cast a spell. And while I will be casting a lot of spells, everybody else is going to need to also, or they're just going to die. So constantly pinging them for 2 whenever they do something means that they're going to have a lot harder time enacting their game plan without getting in range of Electro dying to just kill them. Fault Line, so I did consider Rolling Earthquake, but Rolling Earthquake is a sorcery. So Fault Line being an instant and not killing our commander, if we don't need it to, are both kind of more important than being able to kill flyers and possibly hitting our commander with Rolling Earthquake. And it's a way to deal a bunch of damage to each player, so that way they get closer in range for Electro. Gamble, I'm not a huge fan of Gamble when my deck does not have graveyard synergies, where discarding the card can actually just be good. I really prefer that when I run Gamble, but I'm a mono red deck, and sometimes you just have to run what you have to run if you want to get the thing to your hand in a timely fashion. Goblin Matron for tutoring up the certain goblin cards that we might want that help make lots of goblins, so that way our goblins matter cards can make more mana for us. Flame Rift is a fairly efficient burn spell, 2 mana to deal 4 damage to everybody. Granted, we take 4, but I don't think that's a huge deal in this deck. Citadel of Pain stops control players from leaving up mana without taking damage while it's in play, so either the player has to tap out, or they're going to take extra damage, and we want to tap out anyway. So the Citadel is just forcing us to do it on our turn instead of waiting until an opponent's turn, like the last opponent before we go to tap all the mana. So it's not hurting us anywhere near as bad as it's hurting everybody else. Similarly, Well of Discovery, I'm already incentivized to tap out each turn, so I might as well draw a card at end of turn, and we'll still have all the floating mana anyway if we need to cast anything. Phyrexian Altar lets us sacrifice most likely Goblin tokens for extra mana, and it also lets us sacrifice our commander for a red mana if we can kill somebody with him. So that way we actually have a sacrifice outlet for him. I think I have a few more outlets in the deck list, but this is one of the strongest ones because it gives you more mana to deal more damage with him. Tectonic Instability, whenever a player taps a land. I'm sorry, it's not taps a land. This is the ETB one. Sorry, I'm confusing it with one of the other ones. So when a land ETBs, it taps all lands its controller controls. So, again, we want to tap out anyway, so it doesn't bother us at all. But it probably bothers other players that were hoping to hold up mana on other turns. The Mirari is on the list because we have a bunch of instants and sorceries, and copying them is always good times. Price of Glory. When a player taps a land for mana on another player's turn, it destroys that land. Again, we can float our mana, so stops opponents from doing stuff on other players' turns with their mana anyway. I don't know that we need all of the ones that I have on the list, but I put them all on the list and we'll figure out which ones we're running. Bloodstained Mire, Brightstone Ritual, sorry. Bloodstained Mire is on the list, but fetch lands are kind of self-explanatory. And I usually run shuffle effects and Sensei's Top regardless of what I'm doing, so it'll depend though, because we don't need it as much as we normally would for other decks, so we might be able to cut the lands if I need to, but... So a Brightstone Ritual is a red instant that adds a red mana for each goblin I have. So, more goblins, more better. Insurrection is a 8 mana sorcery that can usually win you the game if the board states are clogged. So, also we have Phyrexian Altar, so if we steal everybody's creatures, we will be able to sacrifice them. And again, I think I have a few other sacrifice outlets on the list, just to make sure that Electro gets to do the cool thing, even if nobody's going to oblige me by killing him. Mana Echoes. So, 4 mana enchantment, when a creature enters, regardless of who controls it, by the way, I add a colorless mana for each creature I control that shares a creature type with it. So, goblins. Now, it is colorless mana, which means it does not hold over for Electro, and it does not... but it can be used for his ability. Like, if he dies while I have a ton of colorless mana, like, if I put 3 goblins into play while I have multiple goblins in play and get 3 triggers of this and then sacrifice Electro or kill him with a lightning bolt or something, chain lightning my own Electro, then I will still get to do all of the cool things with that extra mana. So it might make it... I'm also considering, although it's not on the list, the Energy Refractor from Brothers War, which would let you convert 2 generic mana into a red mana repeatedly, so that way you can float the extra mana. But right now I don't think that's necessary. We'll have to see what the deck is looking like by the time we get done with it. Skirk Prospector is a goblin that lets you sacrifice goblins for red mana. Sulfuric Vortex is players can't gain life, and each upkeep deals 2 damage to that player. So there are a bunch of players can't gain life cards in here to stop anybody from, gaining life out of range of Electro. We don't want anybody gaining 10 trillion life, and because I don't have an infinite loop combo in the deck, so I cannot deal an arbitrary amount of damage. I need to actually be able to hit the numbers that they've gotten to naturally, and that's not necessarily an easy thing to pull off. So I would like for them to not be able to get that much life. Extraplanar Lens comes into play, exile a land, then all lands with the same name as that land tap for an additional mana. So exile a mountain, let all my mountains tap for double red. O-Stone is my preferred reset button. Skull Clamp is in here because of all the goblin tokens that I'm potentially making as a way to turn them into cards. Doubling Cube. 3 tap, double the amount of mana I have floating. So, obviously, I need to have at least 7 mana floating. Otherwise, I won't have... if I have 6 and I spend 3 and tap it, I'm going to get 3 mana back, so that's not really helping anything. So, I need to have at least 7 mana floating, which should not be an issue for this deck at all. Mana Geyser is a 5 mana sorcery that adds red for each tap land my opponents have. That counts all opponents, so if we get to a particular flurry of turns, especially with my cards that tap all of their lands, or encourage them to tap their lands on their turn, then we might be able to get a ton of mana from this card. Kiki is in here partially because he's a goblin and partially because copying things is just always helpful. If I copy any of my goblins that make more goblins, especially something like Howler's Heavy, then I'm going to be able to do a lot more with my cards each turn, and that's always helpful. There's Sensei's Top, as promised. Braid of Fire is just absolutely perfect for this deck. Printed back when Mana Burn was still a thing, where the Braid of Fire's cumulative upkeep of giving you a red mana would actually be, a downside at some point in time. Now it just always works, and also you can just keep adding red mana. If Electro dies and this thing stays in play, you can keep adding red mana until you can eventually recast him, and then the next upkeep you'll get like 30 red mana, or whatever number you're up to, and then it'll start floating again. It can't really be used to help cast him, because we can't cast him at instant speed, but, details, still incredibly powerful. Gauntlet of Power is Gauntlet of Might, except I get to choose what color it affects, and it makes the basic lands associated with that color tap for the extra mana. We'll be choosing red and mountains, of course. Pyrohemia is the red pestilence, so as long as there's a creature in play, Pyrohemia stays in play, until it gets destroyed by normal enchantment removal instead. And pay a red, deal 1 damage to each player and creature. Seems like a good spot to dump all my extra mana to get everybody in range of Electro. And possibly to kill Electro off, so that way I can just burn down the one player in particular that I need to. Vegas of the Moon is another Blood Moon effect. Soulbright Flamekin. So, 2 mana, 2/1 Elemental Shaman. You can spend 2 mana to give a creature trample, but if you activate this ability 3 times in a single turn, it triggers to also give you 8 red mana back. So this allows me to turn large amounts of colorless from things like the Mana Echoes into red mana, but it also just lets me get 2 extra red mana every turn cycle. As long as I have 6 mana floating, I can activate this 3 times, because I can always respond to the activation with another activation, and the 3rd time it resolves, you get the extra red mana. So opponents can kill this thing, but it doesn't stop you from being able to get the mana from it for that turn. So Flame Javelin is 3 mana, instant speed, deal 4 damage, and that's about as good as it gets for a single target deal 4 damage effect in Magic. Jaws of Stone deals X damage divided as I choose among any number of targets based on the number of mountains I have, which should be almost all of my lands, if not actually all of my lands. Stigma Lasher is worse Screaming Nemesis, but that doesn't mean I'm not going to consider it also. Also of note, it is double red for a 2/2, and I do have Nykthos and Nyx Lotus on the list. So creatures that have a lot of red mana in their casting cost, and all permanents really, helping with the devotion to that is also a thing. But yeah, when it deals damage to a player, that player can't gain life this game. It is a 2/2 Wither. Burst Lightning. 1 mana for 2 damage, 5 mana for 4 damage. Neither side is efficient, but it is versatile. If I need to kill something early, like a Deathrite Shaman, or I don't know, a Soul Sister, something that's going to annoy me early on, or possibly be a combo piece, then I need cheap interaction. And Lightning Bolt and Chain Lightning are already on the list, so there's only so much I can add to it. And 5 mana to deal 4 damage lets it kill a few other things that other 1 mana 2 damage burn spells never could. So, including players that have 4 life at the time. Spire Barrage, similar to Jaws of Stone, except it is X damage to 1 target based on the number of mountains I have instead of divided. There's Valakut, because even if I run a bunch of non-basic land hate, I'm definitely running Valakut in this deck. Searing Blaze has the potential to deal 3 damage to a creature and a player for 2 red mana. So it's at least worth considering for that. Plus, my fetch lands mean that I can potentially activate it at instant speed on somebody else's turn for the 3 damage, because I can trigger landfall. Flame Slash is one of the most efficient red creature removal spells we're going to get at 1 mana for 4 damage. Also, we do have a couple cards on the list that care if we deal a bunch of damage to a creature with a target effect, like Immodane, who will then deal a bunch of damage to our opponents. So, still worth having on the list for that, even if it can't go face normally. Galvanic Blast, I do have a decent number of artifacts on the list. We'll see if we have enough to make this red mana deal 4 damage to any target. Because if we can get it anywhere near consistent for that, then it actually outshines Lightning Bolt, which is already one of the best cards in our list. Cough of the Hammer untaps a mountain and turns it into a 4/4, so we can tap it for red mana again. Also is -2 adds red for each mountain we have, so in a late game scenario, he can basically function as a red ritual, adding a ton of extra mana. And if we get to his ultimate, my lands just straight up tap to deal damage at that point, which is incredibly helpful. Tunnel Ingus damages players if they play more than 1 land per turn, so it hurts ramp decks, while giving us ways to deal damage to them to get them closer in range for Electro, because they're going to ramp early on when they have a higher life total anyway, and then later on, if we can stop them from gaining life, or if they've just, paid too much life to be safe, then we get them with Electro. The Galvanoth is, at the beginning of my upkeep, I can look at the top card of my library, and I can reveal an instant or sorcery and cast it for free. Since we're planning on having a lot of instants and sorceries in the deck, just getting a free spell every turn and an extra red mana from our commander for our commander seems good. Into the Core is one of my favorite artifact removal spells. It's fallen off a lot recently, because a lot of times destroying large numbers of artifacts is more important than killing 2 specific ones. And, with cards like Vandal Blast, you do get to kill all of your opponent's artifacts without killing all of yours. But there are times where the artifacts are indestructible, and being able to exile the artifact is actually a huge deal. It's mostly good against cards like Darksteel Forge, but with the Infinity Stones starting to get printed, and from what we've seen of the black one, I assume that the other ones will also be indestructible mana rocks with incredibly powerful late game abilities, so being able to exile those is probably going to be something I want access to in the future. Sword of Feast and Famine to untap all of our lands if we connect, so that way we can tap them all again for mana. Also gives our commander protection from one of the better color removal, like spot removal colors in black, so nothing there. Cage Sun is slightly more expensive than either of the gauntlets, but we only have 2 hands, so we can only wear 2 gauntlets anyway. Also, only affects our stuff, unlike the gauntlets, so a little bit better there too. Priest of Orbrask, I don't know how I feel about this one, but it comes into play and adds 3 red mana and costs 3 mana, so if we can use generic mana to cast it, we can float extra red mana, and it is essentially a free card in our deck, because we will just get to keep the mana anyway, so If we need it, it's there. I might wind up cutting it though because it's very low impact. If it were a goblin or a Phyrexian goblin instead of, Phyrexian cleric, I'd probably be doing a lot better. Shrine of Burning Rage, we're going to be casting a lot of red spells, and it is a thing that can deal a lot of damage to an opponent, so you should be able to get tons of counters on it and grow it very quickly. Blasphemous Act is Red's Wrath, and we also have a handful of cards that will care if we deal excess damage to things, so we get that bonus on top of that. Charmbreaker Devils randomly regrows an instant or sorcery from my graveyard every turn. It can also get a huge power boost from casting instants and sorceries, which is not nothing if it can get a free attack in. But for the most part, it is a 6 mana, give me a free spell every turn. Battle Hymn is 2 mana instant, adds a red for each creature I have. So, same as Brightstone Ritual, except my handful of non-goblin creatures, including my commander, will also count for it. Bonfire of the Damned potentially wipes out a player and all of their stuff. So there's a lot we can do with this one, and it's one of the most efficient burn spells if we miracle it. So I didn't want to leave it out, even though most of the red X spells I did leave out because they are not that impressive compared to our commander's ability to just deal X damage anyway when he dies. Like, we're actually losing out on a couple points of damage by the mana and the casting cost next to the X for a lot of these spells, so I need them to either be damaging all of our opponents, or at least doing something like Bonfire where it can also wipe their board in the process. Zealous Conscripts, we do have sacrifice outlets, and also it's just a very efficient creature, stealing one of their things. Also, it does combo with Kiki Jiki if we want to do that, but I have very few ways to tutor this combo, so it feels more like an oops, these two cards showed up at the same time, rather than a game plan that's distracting from our main win con. I have Gutter Snipe on the list because it deals 2 damage whenever you cast a non-creature spell, but I'm probably way more interested in Fiery Inscription than Gutter Snipe, but there's only so many enchantment versions of the effect that I can get, so I'd rather have the most efficient creature if I'm going to do that. Mizium Mortars is another Red Wrath, where it doesn't kill my guys, but it can kill a lot of the opponent's creatures. Vandal Blast to destroy all their artifacts. Skullcrack deals 3 damage, but also stops life gain and damage prevention. So it's another way to stop a player from gaining a ton of life, especially if I don't have any of my prevent life gain effects on board, and they try and get like a big life gain thing in while while it looks like they can do it, and then we Skullcrack them, and then they don't gain the life. Interestingly enough, effects like this also prevent life swapping effects. Things like Soul Conduit and Mr. Negative and Profane Transfusion. Things that would let a player that's gotten super low on life basically steal all the life from me or some other player that's been doing better than them. All of these can't gain life effects actually stop that because of... They don't say gain life, but the way they work is one player gains enough life to have the higher life total, and the other player loses enough life to have the lower life total for the swap to occur. So if a player can't gain life, then the swap can't happen. Fanatic of Mogus deals damage based on my devotion to red, so it seemed like a good inclusion. We do have Lightning Strike on the list, but I don't have Incinerate from Ice Age, so Incinerate should also be on the list and should be considered above Lightning Strike. Like, Lightning Strike is just an inferior Incinerate, which is a lateral move from Lightning Bolt. So, in that, it costs more, but also does more. Perforos is on the list because I do make a lot of Goblin tokens, potentially, so I wanted to at least consider him. Satyr Fire Dancer. So when my instant or sorcery damages an opponent, this deals damage equal to that amount to a creature that player controls. allows me to do damage to them while still killing their creatures. Arc Bond. So when the target is dealt damage this turn, it deals that much damage to each player and each other creature. So if I target one of my creatures and cast Blasphemous Act, it's going to deal a ton of damage to everybody and kill anything that's not indestructible with less than 26 toughness or less than 27 toughness. So feels like it should wipe the board at that point. But also just being able to deal 12 to an opponent. Also, it can get my commander killed under the right circumstances if I need it to, where the commander is otherwise safe. So it is another way to trigger that. Outpost Siege, both modes are useful. Creatures leaving play deal a point of damage to any target. Helps if I have a lot of goblins in play, but most of the time I'm just going to get an extra card off of it each turn. My deck has a very low casting cost, and most things aren't worth holding on to. So, like, for extended periods of time, like, if I draw it, I can cast it, I will probably seriously consider casting it anyway. Which is why cards like Wheel of Fortune are in consideration for the deck. And cards like Bedlam Reveler, who gets cheaper for every dead instant and sorcery I have, and ETBs discard my hand to draw 3 cards. The Prowess also doesn't hurt. Chandra Torch of Defiance is on the list because she can add additional mana. She can also give me access to more cards. And she can deal damage to things if she needs to. And the emblem is also pretty powerful. So most likely when I play Chandra, I'm just going to uptick her for red mana that turn. Or uptick her for a spell and deal 2 damage if I don't want that spell or if it's a land or something. Throne of the God Pharaoh is on the list because I knew I was going to want a large number of creatures for the various rituals like Battle Hymn and Brightstone Ritual. So, just in case, this is another way to deal a bunch of damage if I have a whole lot of tapped creatures in play. It's entirely possible that I don't bother with this, like it's too janky, but it was early in the card selection, so it made the list. Hour of Devastation, we have the Mirage Mirror to copy any of my damage multiplier effects. That's its primary purpose. It can also copy non-legendary creatures with strong abilities, or anything else that I could use an extra copy of. Neheb can add a pile of red mana. If I get through for combat damage, my post-main phase, I get red mana for each life an opponent lost this turn. This includes if I do direct damage also in the before combat or during combat. So this can give me a ton of red mana to work with again. Legion Warboss is a goblin, makes a goblin every turn. That goblin does have to attack, so I might not be able to keep it around, but if one player is vulnerable, I get to send that goblin in for a point of damage, and then I have an extra goblin for all the cards that care about how many creatures I have. And it's triggering things like Mana Echoes also. God, I'm starting to lose my voice real bad already. Runaway Steamkin, 1/1 Elemental. Whenever I cast a red spell, it gets a counter if it doesn't have 3 or more counters on it already. And I can remove 3 counters to add 3 red mana. War of the Spark brings us to the 3rd Neheb, and the second one my deck can run, because the first one is a red-black creature before he died. This one is a 5/4 Trampler, and if it deals combat damage to a player or a planeswalker, I can discard any cards in my hand. Should be number of cards from my hand to draw that many cards and add that much red mana to my mana pool. So gets me new cards, gets me extra red mana. Bone Crusher Giant. The instant side of it shuts off damage prevention, which can be useful. It's also 2 red spells. First the burn spell, then the giant. So I thought that was at least worth a little bit of consideration. Irencrag Feet is a 4 mana spell that adds 7 red mana. It does stop me from casting more than one spell that turn, but That's the only restriction on the mana. So something like Geosurge, where I can only spend the mana on creatures and artifacts, was a lot less interesting to me. But something that can add this much extra mana, where I'm just getting 4 extra mana for casting it, or I'm sorry, 3 extra mana for casting it, seemed at least worth considering, and that's before I get any cost reductions in there. Slaying Fire. So this one's interesting. It always deals 3 damage to any target, but if I spend exactly 3 red mana on it, it deals 4 instead. So if the cost gets reduced on this thing by 1 from the medallion, then I actually can never deal 4 damage with it, because I can only ever spend 2 red mana on it. Still seem worth considering. It's still 3 mana, deal 4 damage, or in that scenario, 2 mana, deal 3 damage. So it becomes Lightning Strike at that point, which is not the end of the world. Torbrand increases the amount of damage my sources deal. Also of note, I always have to point this one out because this is the scenario where it comes up the most, where people think it works the way they want it to and it does not. Because of the way replacement effects work, damage multipliers and damage additive effects, like Torbrand versus Emancipation of Fire, do not technically work the way you want them to. A lot of people don't know that, and so a lot of people just play with them as though they did. But the way a replacement effect works is the player or the controller of the card that is affected by the replacement effect chooses the order in which they apply. And for most things, that makes sense. But for things like the damage multipliers and the additive damage effects, that makes 0 sense to anybody. And so when they hear that it works that way, they get really confused why their opponent gets to decide how their cards work. And because of the way replacement effects work, and because they have to work the same for everything, the ones that you would normally want to have work that way all have to, like, all the ones that you wouldn't want to have work that way also have to work the way they do. So for the damage multipliers and additive damage, the player being dealt the damage gets to decide the order of the replacement effects that occur. So Emancipation of Fire would triple the damage, and then Torbrand would add 2 more on top of that, not, effectively add 6 more damage to it. And that's one of those rules that catches people off guard, and it always comes up in decks like these, where people have all of these damage multipliers and all these damage additive effects, because very similar to, your doubling season and your parallel lives and everything, you want all the things that add more and more. And because the 1/1 counters decks with the doubling and the adding counters work the way you want them to, because you control the thing that's being affected, so you get to actually say, okay, it's going to get an extra counter instead of getting 2, it gets 3, and then it gets doubled to 6. You're the controller, and so you get to decide how that works. But with damage additives and damage multipliers, it's the player being affected by them that gets to decide. So because you're never dealing damage to yourself intentionally this way, it deals the damage to the opponents instead. Or the opponents get to decide how the damage is dealt, like which ones apply in which order, so they can multiply by 3 first and then add the 2 in afterwards. And like I said, most players don't know this, and it's very counterintuitive. And I just realized halfway through this rant that my microphone was like arched upward a bit, like I hit it at some point in time. And it's not, so I'm sorry if I sounded a bit distant or if I phased out more often than normal while talking. But yeah, that is how it actually works. That is the rules for the game, and it matters because otherwise damage prevention effects and these type of effects would never, like the damage prevention effects would do almost nothing, and instead they can do almost everything. because they can prevent all of the damage and then there's nothing to multiply or add to. But the way replacement effects work is the player being affected, or the controller of the thing being affected gets to choose the order in which they apply. So, just something that you should know, because it does come up a lot, and this is the one, like, this specific scenario where it's the extra damage is the one everybody wants it to work the other way and gets really upset when you tell them that it doesn't work that way and they find out you're not lying to them. I figured I should run it by all of you who are watching this now, because it's very important, especially if you're going to take this deck and try and play with it. Nyx Lotus, like I said before, we're running the cards that add mana based on my devotion, because I have a ton of permanents with red mana symbols in my mono red deck. At the very least, with my commander out, Nyx Lotus taps for 2 extra red mana, so a 4 mana comes into play, taps for 2 red, is better than Firemind's Vessel, which would have to tap for red and a different color. Leyline Tyrant can also hold over red mana, and when it dies, I can spend red mana to deal damage to any target based on the amount of red mana spent. So it's like a backup copy of our commander, but it also lets the red mana keep floating if they have targeted removal for one of our things. It also, if both of them die at the same time, and I have enough mana to more than kill one player, I can actually hit a different player with the excess mana. Like, you know, I can target the one with Electro and the one with Leyline Tyrant, kill the one with Electro's damage, and have whatever remaining mana floating kill or deal damage to the other player. So that way it's not wasted. And it's a 4 mana 4/4 flyer, so that's not terrible. Royal Eruption, similar to Burst Lightning, is not the most efficient burn spell at a 2 mana sorcery for 3 damage, or 7 mana sorcery to deal 5 damage, but it does have both options, and it's a more modern card that still lets you go to any target with the damage, so that is actually helpful. Roiling Vortex can prevent life gain. It punishes players for playing free spells, which we don't have a ton of in our deck. Like, most of our spells do actually cost mana. Still, the fact that we can float all this mana forever so that we're never tapping our lands for mana is interesting, but we can actually pay mana for most of our spells. So the 5 damage that it deals for somebody casting Force of Will or Fierce Guardianship or something is super helpful. Also, it does deal damage to each player during the upkeep, so it's another way to get players in range of our commander. Skyclave Relic is 3 mana for a mana rock that taps for 1, or 6 mana for 3 mana rocks that tap for 1 mana of any color, and they're indestructible. So spending 6 mana on it now means we can get 3 mana from it next turn and 3 mana the turn after, and now it's paid for itself, so anything past that is free mana towards our commander. And being indestructible does help an awful lot. Again, why I like Into the Core so much. Valakut Exploration, so landfall, we exile the top card of our library, and we can play that card until our next end step. And during that end step, we put the revealed cards that we didn't play into our graveyard and deal that much damage to each opponent. So either we're getting free spells, or we're getting damage on the opponents if we don't want to cast any of the things, or if we can't cast them. So it turns our landfall into extra damage or into free spells, and both of those are good. Very similar to Chandra, where we plus her and we either get to deal 2 damage to our opponents or we get to play another card, and both of those are helpful. Burgi, front face, adds a red mana every time we cast a spell, and that's super helpful because our commander is already doing that if it's an instant or sorcery. So now Lightning Bolt lets us go up mana. Harnfell is also potentially useful, not as good though. Goldspan Dragon not only gives us treasures every time it does things, but also makes treasures add extra mana, which is helpful. Magda, every time she attacks, we get a treasure, and we can turn 5 treasures into a dragon or an artifact. Both useful in this deck. Toralf, if we deal excess damage to an opponent's creature or planeswalker, we get to then deal damage equal to that excess to any target, which, along with damage multipliers, gets out of hand very quickly, because then we get to deal excess damage to the next creature in line, which will probably multiply the amount of excess damage we just dealt. So, if we have Emancipation and a Lightning Bolt, that Lightning Bolt deals 9 damage. So if we kill, like, a 3 toughness creature, the excess damage is 6 now, which then gets tripled to 18, and now it's spiraling, and once we've mowed down all of their creatures, we can finish off the player behind them, because the excess damage is to any target. So Toralf is already pretty strong in the deck, and can do other stuff if we don't have that setup, where he just kind of pings off little creatures whenever we're dealing damage. Crackle with Power is one of the most efficient Red X burn spells for taking out multiple targets. Because once X is high enough, it will kill every player at the table. And since it's up to X targets, we can exclude ourselves just for, let everybody else enjoy the fun. We don't need to indulge in our own Crackle with Power. Introduction to Annihilation. So, we're a mono red deck. We do not have answers to a lot of permanent types, especially enchantments. So having a card that will kill any problematic non-land seems helpful. I do have a couple other cards on the list that also fall into this category, so we might not run intro specifically, but I did want to consider it at least. Stormkiln Artisan is Magecraft Make a Treasure. So it's another way to get extra mana out of every spell that we cast. And it also buffs based on the number of artifacts we have, so it might also attack for a lot of damage. It's still only 2 toughness, so probably not, but when it can, it's going to hit really hard, so that's helpful. Cemetery Gatekeeper. We exile a card from a graveyard when it enters, and whenever a player plays a card that has the same type as the card exiled by this thing, it deals 2 damage to that player. So we can exile any card type that we think our opponents will be playing enough of to maximize the damage we deal to them, or to minimize the amount of damage we deal to ourselves in that case. At the very least, it's going to deal some extra damage, and that's really all I care about. Ideally, we want to, exile an artifact creature, so that way the creature-heavy green deck and the artifact-heavy, blue-red deck both take a lot of extra damage while we just take a little bit, but, we make do with what we can. Exile lands, so that way it becomes Zozu the Punisher. That sort of thing. Chandra Dress to Kill, similar to, but weaker than Torch of Defiance. Her plus gives us a red mana and deals a damage. Her other plus exiles the top card of my deck, and if it's red, I can play it. And her -7 gives me a whole bunch of spells to work with, and when I cast a spell, if it was red, I get to deal damage to any target equal to the amount of mana spent to cast it. So, all good stuff. Atsushi is a 4/4 Flample Dragon for 4, and when it dies, I either get the top 2 cards of my deck to play until end of turn, or I make 3 treasures. So, more mana or more cards. Both things the deck desperately wants. And Atsushi is another dragon I can tutor for with Magda. It interacts with a couple other cards on the list. And because we have a few ways we can sacrifice it, we can also trigger it if we need to, like if the dragon itself is not helping. Fable the Mirror Breaker, the front side makes a goblin, the goblin makes treasures, It lets me rummage 2 cards, and then it turns into a bad Kiki Jiki. So, all upside for this deck. Arcane Bombardment. I'm going to be casting so many spells, ideally anyway, so I might as well get a free one every time I cast one. And if we can get a bunch of cards underneath Arcane Bombardment without it blowing up, we will probably win the game because you are casting all of the copies. So Electro is adding an additional red for every single copy that you cast out from underneath this thing. Glittering Stockpile. Every time we tap it for red, it gets a counter, and we can sacrifice it to add mana equal to the number of counters on it. Professional Facebreaker can give us treasures when our creatures are unblocked, and then can turn those treasures into extra cards if we don't need the mana. Visions of Phyrexia gives us a free card every turn, and if we don't play that card, very similar to Valakut giving us the extra damage, this one turns it into a Power Stone, and notably, Power Stones can be used for abilities, which is what Electro's damage trigger is. So, we can still use the Power Stones to add more mana for that. We just can't float it from turn to turn. Chandra Hope's Beacon copies the first spell I cast each turn. Pluses to add 2 extra mana. She can also +2 exile my top 5, and I can cast an instant or sorcery from among them. And her -X deals X damage to 2 targets. So mostly that copy ability in the first ability, but the other things are still good. City on Fire is a slightly more expensive but convocable Emancipation of Fire. Orobrask. When we cast an instant or sorcery, it gives us a red mana and deals a point of damage to an opponent. If I cast 3 or more instants and sorceries in the same turn, I can flip him into his Saga version, which deals 3 damage to an opponent and each of their creatures. Then I get 3 treasures. Then I can cast instants and sorceries from any graveyard, as though they had flashback and were available to me. And then he flips back over into Orobrask again. So. Fire Inscription, enchantment version of Gutter Snipe. There and Back Again is kind of weird. So the first chapter doesn't really matter. Enchanted creature can't, or not enchanted creature, target creature can't block for as long as the Saga's in play, and the Ring Tempts Me is, for the most part, whatever. Chapter 2 gives me a mountain into play, notably does not have to be basic, so I can get some of the non-basic mountains that are on the list. I think I only have like 1 or 2 of those, but still relevant. And then Chapter 3 makes Smog, who is a 6/6 flyer, and when he dies, I make 14 treasures. So it gets me a mountain, and then it gets me a dragon that dies into 14 extra mana for me. Flick a Coin deals a damage, makes a treasure, and draws a card. So all of those are potentially useful to me. The 1 damage is probably the least relevant, but it is still a point of damage. It does go to any target, but I will get a red mana rebate from casting it, a treasure from casting it, and a card draw. So I did wonder if I wanted more of the red mana draw card and do a thing cards, like Crash Through, and I might, but I want to see what the deck looks like first. There's Imodane as promised. When my instant or sorcery that targets only a single creature deals damage to that creature, it also deals that much damage to each opponent. The Virtue of Courage is when my source deals non-combat damage to an opponent, I may exile that many cards from the top, and I can play them this turn, so I can get a bunch of extra cards. And the Adventure side is 2 damage to any target for 2 mana, which is underwhelming, but it's still a free spell attached to my potential massive card draw spell, so there's that. Bonehorde Dracosaur, so it gives me access to 2 cards every turn. Depending on what cards I exiled, I either make treasures or make 3/1 dinosaurs, or 1 of each. And it's also a 5 mana 5/5 flying first strike. So all good things. Schimmel It does cast the spell at the end of my turn, but it is casting a spell for free if the mana cost is 5 or less. And if I hit something I really don't want to cast right now, I can always put it in my hand. So most of my spells are cheap enough that Shimmel can hit them, and every time it hits an instant or sorcery, I get extra mana from my commander. And now my soda's gone, and I still have so many more cards to go over. Vengeful Tracker. When an opponent sacrifices an artifact, it deals 2 damage to them. This thing is almost entirely in here to punish players for things like treasures. Treasures, clues, food tokens. But it also punishes them for sacrificing artifacts for, like, you know, things like Relic of Progenitus and whatnot. Just adds in, like, extra incremental damage to get them closer in range for Electro to actually kill them. Bandit's Hall taps for a mana, so it's already being used to charge Electro. But as I commit crimes, it gets counters, and I can remove the counters to draw cards eventually. So, definitely worth considering. Rodeo Pyromancer is the first spell I cast every turn, gives me 2 red mana. So I can go up a lot of mana with cheap spells that way. In conjunction with it and my commander, it and Burgi, etc. All of them together. Scorching Shot, because there aren't a ton of cards that can deal this much damage, so 2 mana, 5 damage is worth considering. And again, we have cards like Immodane. Sulfum is another damage multiplier. Notably, almost all my damage multipliers are when my source deals damage to an opponent or a permanent an opponent controls, so I don't have to worry that the ones that are going to deal damage to me, like Rift Bolt, or I'm sorry, not Rift Bolt, Flame Rift, won't deal me 8 damage, for example. Sunspire Lynx deals damage to players equal to the number of non-basic lands they control, and while it's in play, players can't gain life and damage can't be prevented. So it's another no life gain, no damage prevention that punishes opponents for their non-basic land counts. Razorkin Needlehead deals a point of damage to an opponent when they draw a card. Screaming Nemesis cuts off life gain once it deals damage with its effect. And we have a bunch of ways to damage it, so that way it can deal damage to the opponents, including a few ways to deal 2 to it. So that way we can cut off an opponent's life gain without losing the Screaming Nemesis. Count on Luck is 3 red mana, so it's good for our devotion, and it gives me an extra card to work with every turn. House Squad Heavy makes a goblin every turn. That goblin has to attack. And it also starts my engines, and if I'm at max speed, it taps to add 1 red mana for each goblin I have. So, a repeatable Brightstone ritual, and very helpful to copy with Kiki and the Reflection. Corey Steelcutter, because I'm casting a lot of non-creature spells, so making Prowess Monks with Trample seems fine. Clive lets me discard my hand to draw cards equal to my devotion to red, so gives me a bunch of extra cards to work with, and flips into a Freet. So a Freet fights a creature when it flips over as a 9/9, and then chapters 2 and 3 add 4 red mana each time. And when it has the counters, it flips back over into Clive, who then lets me discard and draw a bunch of cards again. The Regalia is a vehicle that when it attacks, I will definitely hit a land and put it into play tapped, so it will find me more mountains. Sabo Tender's landfall deal a point of damage to each opponent. I don't know how important that's going to be. Zell lets me play an extra land each turn, and since most of my land will be basic mountains, that just means I'll have an extra red mana to work with each turn. The only way Zell actually starts hurting me is if something like Confounding Conundrum is in play, where I actually get punished for playing extra lands. And I can't kill my own Zell because I don't have anything to sacrifice him to or ways to deal 3 damage to him in hand at the time. So that can be problematic, but he does give me the extra land drop and make sure I hit my land drop, so things like the Sabo Tender. I also might have considered the dragon from uh, Battle for Zendikar or Oath of the Gatewatch that deals damage on landfall and 2 damage if it's a mountain. But we'll have to see about that, depending on what I want to do. Electro's our commander. Maximum Carnage. So, forces everybody to attack, so we want to play it during main phase 2, that we don't have to attack. Chapter 2 adds 3 red mana, and Chapter 3 deals 5 damage to each opponent. So, it's giving us extra mana, it's getting our opponents in range, it's forcing them to make bad attacks. All of those seem good. Molten Man gets me a mountain, has power and toughness equal to the number of mountains I control, and when he dies, I have to sacrifice a land. So most of the time, he will be a 3 mana 4/4, and if he lives, I get extra mana every turn, and when he finally dies, I lose one of my lands, which sucks, but it's the land that he gave me anyway, so we're good to go. The Avatar set, from what we have on the spoiler list. The Legend of Roku. 4 mana saga. Chapter 1 is exile my top 3 and I can play them until the end of my next turn. Chapter 2 gives me an extra mana of any color. And Chapter 3 flips into Roku himself, who has Firebending 4, so when he attacks I add 4 red mana. And I can spend 8 mana to make a 4/4 flying dragon that has Firebending 4. So he is an incredible mana sink that is also generating huge amounts of mana. Redirect Lightning lets me either pay red in 2 or red in 5 life to change the target of any spell with 1 target. So deflects things away from my important stuff onto other things and stops my opponents from, targeting themselves with, I guess, Time Walk effects. Specifically Time Warp and whatnot, because Capture and Temporal Manipulation don't target. But, anything along those lines where it would be better off if, I drew 3 cards instead of you or something. Sozin's Comet gives all of my creatures Firebending 5. I can cast it for 5 mana, or I can foretell it and cast it for 3 mana. So all of those goblins suddenly attack to add 5 red mana. That just floats forever. Seems good. Zuko the Exiled Prince is a 4 mana 4/3 with Firebending 3. I can also spend 3 mana to exile my top card and play it until end of turn. So gives me tons of extra mana, and if I need to find cards, he can do that too. His exile is a 5 mana instant speed lesson that exiles a creature, artifact, or enchantment, and the controller investigates. So worse than Annihilation because it misses out on certain card types, including Planeswalker. Better than Annihilation because it's instant speed and makes them pay mana to get the card, and can still hit like 3 of the most problematic card types among permanents. The Bender's Water Skin is a 3 mana rock, but it untaps itself every turn. So we get to get an extra red mana on each player's turn. White Lotus Tile is, I believe, a 4 mana artifact. I have to double check that, but it enters the battlefield tapped, and not 3, 4. And it taps for X mana of any one color, where X is the highest number of total creatures I have in play that share a creature type. So all those goblins, ideally. Fire Nation Palace can tap for red mana. It's also 1 red in tap to give a creature Firebending 4, so I go up a mana, since it's 2 mana to activate and the land itself. From the Jumpstart Avatar set, a different version of Roku is 3 and triple red for a 6/6, and whenever any player attacks anybody, I add 6 red mana to my mana pool, and I can spend 3 red mana to give a creature +3/+0 until end of turn. So whenever anybody attacks, regardless of who they're attacking, I get 6 red mana. Seems incredibly strong. And Longshot Rebel Bowman, I believe Longshot is the character's name, is 3 and a red for a human rebel ally, 3/3 with reach. My non-creature spells cost 1 less to cast, and when I cast a non-creature spell, I deal 2 damage to each opponent. So it is a cost reduction effect and a gutter snipe together. Imperial Recruiter tutors for a bunch of my goblins. Inferno Titan deals a bunch of damage when it comes in and when it attacks, so it's worth considering just for those things. It's also a mediocre place to stick all my extra red mana, because it does have fire breathing. Krenko Mob Boss taps to make goblins equal the number of goblins I have. Gets very out of hand with all the other goblin makers. Pyromancer's Goggles taps to add red, and if I cast an instant or sorcery with the red mana, I copy it. Notably, if I don't have an instant or sorcery to cast, and I float the red mana with this, it retains that property, and if I don't use that specific red mana for anything, if I use Doubling Cube, I believe it's still, like, the extra mana still copies, I believe. It's very weird. So Doubling Cube doesn't copy restrictions, but it does copy effects. Like, if you use Doubling Cube, one of the weirdest things that Doubling Cube has ever been used for is to copy the mana floating from Jeweled Lotus in a non-commander format in order to make huge amounts of mana because of the floating mana from Jeweled Lotuses. I have to double check that, but I believe the red mana definitely retains its ability across turns if it stays in the mana pool. I think Doubling Cube, but we'll double check that one, will still let you copy spells with it if it's floating. Apex of Power, which I can almost definitely cast from my hand, will give me access to the top 7 cards of my deck and give me a full 10 red mana in exchange for the 10 red mana I just spent. So effectively free, and I go up a mana from my commander. Chandra Awakened Inferno just makes it very hard for opponents to survive. The +2 to make the emblem has them constantly getting down ticked on their turns, and when you factor in all of our other things that stop life gain and deal extra damage, it puts them on a very fast clock if she's not dealt with. And considering that she can't be countered, it's very hard not to wind up with the emblem from her. Really takes a stifle effect followed by killing her before I get to use her again. Double Vision copies the first instant or sorcery I cast each turn. Fire Emancipation increases damage 3 times. Bolt Wave, 1 red mana, 3 damage to each opponent. If I'm already running Flame Rift, I'm definitely running Bolt Wave. Chandra Flame Shaper, 7 mana, +2 adds 2 red mana, and I can exile my top 3 and choose one to be able to play this turn. +1, I make a token copy of a creature I control with haste, and I sacrifice that token end of turn. And -4 deals 6 damage divided among creatures and planeswalkers, so she can be a burn spell to get rid of creatures, she can give me mana and cards, or she can make token copies of things like Howler's Heavy, so that way I can make a ton of mana off of that thing. Seer Slicer Goblin gives me an extra goblin at the end of any turn where I attacked, so all those goblin token makers that force my goblins to attack, well, now I'll get a free goblin regardless, and if the goblin survives, I get 2 free goblins. Twin Flame Tyrant increases damage. Pashalik Mons, so when my goblin dies, this deals 1 damage to any target, and I can spend 4 mana and sack a goblin to make 2 goblins. So, all my things that give me mana based on the number of creatures I have, I can increase the number of creatures that I have so that those things will be more effective. And as my goblins die, I get to deal damage, so makes things like Goblin Bombardment a lot stronger. Fury, I can cast it for free by exiling a red card, or I can just hard cast it, and it deals the 4 damage. Ragavan gives me treasure when he attacks, and access to opponent's cards if he connects. Oh no, he has to connect, but we get the treasure and the card if he connects. Sword of Hearth and Home can blink a creature. in order to reset it. It can also get a land from my deck. So one of the cool things you can do with this is blink Electro. So that way you can deal a ton of damage to somebody and then have him come right back and then re-equip him and, have an extra land to work with. So you don't even lose the mana because no phases will have changed. So whatever you didn't spend on him is still available to you. I definitely should have grabbed my water before this. Ashling Flame Dancer, 4 mana 4/4, don't lose unspent red mana, so same as the dragon and our commander. Magecraft, I always rummage, but if it's the second spell I've cast, I deal 2 damage to each opponent and each of their creatures, and if it's the third instant or sorcery I've cast this turn or copied, I get 4 red mana. So if I cast a bunch of spells, I get a bunch of extra mana back, and I get to deal damage to the opponents and their creatures, and I get to look for more cards to do things with. Ghostfire Slice is 3 mana to deal 4 damage. It's colorless, so it can hit pro-red creatures and hexproof from red creatures. And also, if any opponent has a multicolored spell, it costs 2 less to cast, so it becomes very mana efficient. Pinnacle Monk is in here because I can count it as a land, since it can come into play as a red source, and I can pay 3 life to have it untapped. But it's also a 5 mana 2/2 prowess that regrows an instant or sorcery if I need it to. Commander's Plate turns Electro into a much more dire threat, giving him +3/+3 and protection from all non-red colors. Jessica's Will can give us mana if an opponent has a full hand, and can let us exile cards so that we can play them until end of turn. Ancient Copper Dragon, if it ever connects, I roll a d20 and get that many treasures. Descent into Avernus, every turn it gets 2 counters, then everybody makes X treasures and takes X damage from it, where X is the number of counters on it. So it will ramp our opponents, but it will also deal damage to them, and I have to believe that with the way our deck is set up, we want that extra damage a lot more than they do. Chaos Warp is on the list because it's kind of hard for it not to be. I'm not a huge fan of Chaos Warp, but it does deal with any permanent as long as it doesn't randomly flip into that permanent or something worse. So, Arcane Signet for ramp. From Ashes destroys all non-basic lands, but lets everybody put a basic land into play from their deck for each one that they lost, which can be very painful if I have the Tunnel Ingus out and everybody, like each opponent is taking a bunch of damage for every land that they have to search out to replace the ones they just lost. Sudden Demise can deal X damage to creatures of one color, so as long as I don't need to name red, I can save all of my stuff. Disrupt Decorum goads everything in play, which makes it a lot easier for my things to be able to get in for damage. And also make sure the opponents aren't attacking me in the meantime for a turn cycle. Coveted Jewel is a 6-drop, but it taps to add 3 mana of any one color, and draws me 3 cards on ETB. Obviously, the downside is other players can steal it, but they do risk having me steal it back at that point, because I can go very wide with the goblins that we make. Unpowered Auto Generator taps to put a charge counter on itself, then adds mana for each charge counter on it. So eventually it gets very out of hand. Deflecting Swat is one of the best mono red cards, protecting our things. Surge to Victory. It's a 6-drop sorcery. I exile a card from my graveyard, instant or sorcery, and then my creatures get +X+O based on the converted mana cost of the spell exiled. And if any of them deal combat damage to a player, I get to cast a copy of that spell for free. So that can very, very rapidly get out of hand, depending on the spell. That should be Bitterthorn. That should be E, not an N. Is a living weapon that When it deals combat damage, I get to search my deck for a basic land and put into play tapped. Siege Gang Lieutenant makes 2 free goblins every turn that I have my commander and can throw goblins at targets. Caldera Pyremaw is a 3/3 dragon. When I cast an instant or sorcery, this gets a +1 counter, and then it deals damage equal to its power to an opponent. So it doesn't take much for this thing to deal a ton of damage. Bothersome Quasit. 3 mana, 3/2 menace. When I cast a non-creature spell, I goad an opponent's creatures, and goaded creatures my opponents control can't block. So more ways to get blockers out of the way for my stuff to get through. The Scepter of Eternal Glory is a 4 mana rock, except if I have 3 lands with the same name in play, it taps for 3 mana instead. So it becomes a more mana efficient Gilded Lotus. Pip-Boy, equipped creature, when it attacks, I choose one. I can loot, so I can go find better cards. Put a 1/1 counter on the creature, so it grows Electro into a more dire threat that they can't ignore. Or I just untap 2 lands, so I can get more mana to float every turn. General Crete is a 3 mana 2/2 goblin. When one of my goblins attacks, I make a 1/1 goblin that's tapped and attacking. And when my creature enters the battlefield, she deals 1 damage to each opponent. Name Sticker Goblin is red and 2 for a 2/2 goblin guest. So it enters the battlefield, you put a name sticker on it, then you add red mana for each different vowel, including Y in the name. Notably, I have 9 stickers here, because you have to choose 10 stickers, and then 3 of them at random get selected from that collection to be the ones you have available during the game. We have 9 of them that add 4 or more mana for at least one of the names on that sticker. So the goblin will always generate more mana than it costs to cast, because we will always have access to at least 2 out of 3 will have 4+ vowels in 1 or more of the names. So you will be able to go up mana for casting this thing every single time. And then from the other section, we have Fiendish Duo, who is a 5/5 first strike that increases damage. Jaws from the Secret Lair deals damage to opponents whenever an artifact is destroyed or sacrificed. So that one can get out of hand pretty quickly with treasures and other things for just dealing extra damage. And notably, it doesn't matter who controls the artifact that was sacrificed or destroyed. It's not just mine. And then Thember Shard is from the Dungeons and Dragons movie tie-in Secret Lair, and is a 6 mana 5/5 trample. When it enters, it deals X damage to each other creature without flying in each player based on the number of mountains I control, so it can deal a lot of damage to all of the players and most of the creatures. And when it attacks, I can exert it to gain flying until end of turn. So that is all, 189 cards on Electro's list. So next time we will start working on reducing that number down to a more manageable thing. I am going to go take a break and get some water. So thank you for watching, and I will see you next time. Good rest of your day.